Good morning.
Good morning.
My pastor says all the time when you go to these different places, you hear these different speakers, don't believe the introduction. He suggests there's always someone willing to say, and often someone willing to script how great they are. And more than anything else, he said that as a cautionary tale to a young preacher learning under his guidance and tutelage, that often that's just a setup anyway. But it is good for us to be here, and I'm pleased to be here with you on this morning. Honored to have the occasion to bring a closing word. As I said this morning on social media, I am both inspired and intimidated to follow Dr. Robert Putnam on yesterday. One of the things you learn in the church is, you know, when you're preaching a revival, these multi-night church services, you don't ever want to preach the last night without coming to see what's going on the night before. So I came yesterday to the luncheon, and that's kind of a mistake, because then you get nervous about other stuff that's going on and hear things that have been so powerful. We're not inspired and engaged yesterday by Dr. Putnam. He was wonderful. So we're pleased to have the opportunity to share. It's also good to be here with those who are serving this community so well in the community action agencies here in the St. Louis metropolitan region. Yesterday, I saw across the room, I didn't get a chance to directly engage him, Mr. Mark Sanford of People's Health Centers, Beta Jean Kerr People's Health Centers, which was my wife's first place of employment fresh out of dental school. She was a public health dentist there at People's Health Centers and loved working with Mr. Sanford and their work there. And we greatly appreciate the service of that local agency here in our community. We also, of course, are really pleased and excited about the work. We also are absolutely pleased and excited about the work that has been happening at CASEL, the Community Action Agency of St. Louis County. And I am a bit biased. I like the people. I've got some friends that are on the board there, Cynthia Jordan, Reverend and Pastor Derek Perkins, and others. But I'm uniquely excited now with the new leadership of Senia Bosman, who is a great friend, colleague in this community and in work, and previously served as the board chair at Deaconess Foundation. And so we were very excited to hear of her call to CASEL and her leadership there. And so we thank those leaders of these agencies here in St. Louis City and St. Louis County for their work, and are pleased to be here. And I just hope I don't embarrass y'all since I just called y'all's name. That being said, I'd like to engage with you a bit dialogically. Let me finish my shout outs. One very inspirational young person and much of the work that I'll kind of share with you from today is inspired by young people in this community. I didn't even know was going to be here today, but she's a student at St. Louis University and one of the inspirational figures out of the Ferguson uprising and organizing that came from it. It happens to also be a beloved disciple at St. John's Church. Our dear sister Alicia Songe is sitting right up front. So all of those things being said and wrapping those things up, I want to enter into some conversation and suggest that part of what we are here to do today, and part of what we are wrestling with in our reality, and part of what Dr. Putnam left for me to try to tie up today, is some unfinished business. So I'd like to talk a little bit about unfinished business. Is that all right? I should suggest to some of you that although I have rooted and grown in the historic black church tradition, particularly in the Baptist church, I serve the United Church of Christ congregation today. It is an inner city, interracial congregation. I've served in many interracial and multiracial settings, and when I speak in those settings, I find a couple of things that I have to let people know up front. First of all, I have found over the course of my time in service that people who are not out of the historic black church tradition and who are not from the church tradition that I've come to know find it rude to speak when the speaker is speaking. But people who grew up in the black church and black folks are not in any wise constrained by such rules or protocol and and so I come to let you know and to affirm every now and then I'll slip into this space that comes out of the historic Black church tradition called call and response, where I don't believe it's rude to speak back to me or to speak while I'm speaking. If there is something you affirm, you can go ahead and say so. Say, yeah, that's all right. And if there's something that you don't, just kind of say, and I try to come back around and fix it. And so I may ask a question that seems rhetorical, but I actually do want a response, and that might help me keep my time. So you can talk back to me. Is that all right? Then we rehearsed it a little bit, then we see how that goes. I want to talk a little bit about unfinished business. I want to begin rooting in the story around the same time of the war on poverty that birthed the community action program that has found many of us in this, that has located many of us in this room today. There was some unfinished business and unfinished work that we found out about on April 4th, 1968. April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and there was found among his effects the number of things that are always found among his effects. Always on his person, Dr. King carried with him a Bible. That kind of made sense. He was a preacher. He always carried with him a copy of the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Why? Because he understood all of America to be the congregation to which he was called, and he drew on the values of American society and the concepts of the American dream that Dr. Putnam talked about on yesterday as part of his sources of authority for the sake of articulating a vision for the world. And so he always had a copy of the Bible, and he always had a copy of the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and he always had a copy of a little book called Jesus and the Disinherited that was written by Howard Thurman, a Christian, African-American Christian mystic from Florida who taught at Boston University's School of Theology, where Dr. King did his PhD work. He always carried that book with him because it had for him an understanding of Christology, an articulation in theology, an understanding of Jesus Christ for people, as Dr. Thurman called it, for people who lived with their backs against the wall. And on April 4th, 1968, we found among his effects those three things that he always had with him. But also among his effects, there was found an unfinished manuscript. There was an unfinished manuscript and sermon that he had already titled. And I wonder what would have happened if he preached this unfinished manuscript, the unfinished manuscript and the unfinished sermon that he was working on when he died and when he was cut down in the prime of his life was entitled, Why America May Go to Hell. What would have happened if he preached that? This is a particularly poignant question in an election year. We recall the sermon of a gentleman I spent all of last week with in a retreat for the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. His name, you may recall, is Jeremiah Wright. And in another election year in 2008, he raised questions about the future of America in very similar language. And he was not treated with a holiday. Rather, he was remarkably and markedly castigated by much of American society and pushed aside from a place of influence. What would have happened if this revered hero of American history, Dr. King, had preached that sermon, Why America May Go to Hell? This is a particularly poignant question when we note that he died exactly 1 year to the day after his famous A Time to Break Silence or Beyond Vietnam speech that was given at the historic pulpit built by John D. Rockefeller at Riverside Church in New York, when he challenged his former allies in the Johnson administration for their failed war, advancing only the interest of what he called the three hounds of hell: racism, extreme capitalism, and militarism. And he argued, went so far as also to rob resources from the war on poverty that created the Community Action Program. For this, he was vilified by black and white people alike. Many say this was the moment that placed the final target on his back. What would have happened if he preached that unfinished manuscript? Interesting question when we consider that on the last Sabbath that he would see the sanctuary that he called folk to, in the language of the movement today, hashtag stay woke. With his message, remaining awake through a great revolution. In that sermon preached on the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. on March 30th, 1968, the last Sunday of his life, he critiqued the federal government for not advancing the critical recommendations of the White House Conference on Civil Rights, and he questioned its fidelity to the assessment of the then recently released Kerner Commission. Would the nation have heard this blistering critique? Would it have already repented from what Reverend Jim Wallace called the original sin of racism in America? What if he finished that unfinished business? And to be clear, Martin Luther King left more than an unfinished sermon. He also left a campaign unfinished. Some of you recall the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was in the midst of a major mobilization to bring thousands of poor people from across the nation to Washington, D.C. The leaders of this faith-rooted ministry, whose stated mission was to redeem the soul of America, saw themselves as what Reverend Joseph Lowry once called them, chaplains for the common good. In that final Sunday sermon, Dr. King talked about the experiences of his learning journey in Newark and Harlem earlier that week to build support for the Poor People's Campaign. He said, and I quote, "I walked into the homes of welfare mothers. I saw them in conditions, no, not with wall-to-wall carpet, but wall-to-wall rats and roaches. One mother pointed out the walls with all the ceiling falling through. She showed me the holes where the rats came in. She said, night after night, we have to stay awake to keep the rats and roaches from getting to the children. And the tragedy is," he went on to say, "so often poor Americans are invisible because America is so affluent, so rich." With these images of their own experiences in mind, SCLC leaders wanted to bring the plight of the poor to the Capitol with an encampment and occupation on the National Mall in the District of Columbia. Unfortunately, after King's tragic assassination, the effort lost steam. While the Reverend Jesse Jackson took up the banner and moved forward with the mass mobilization, turnout was hurt, and in what seemed to be a perfect storm, pouring rain fell upon the encampment. So the most enduring images of the initiative are a dejected Jackson among leaky tents with the iconography of the most memorable monuments in the nation in the background. After this, whatever energy was left from the campaign was deflated, and the work was left unfinished. Unfinished sermons from American prophets and campaigns by faith-rooted communities leave unfinished movements on the social landscape. Dr. King's move from national issues of integration to an international examination of human rights. He spoke specifically of the impact of the war in Vietnam, robbing resources from the war on poverty, and of the hunger of children in India, Africa, and Asia, as well as those in Harlem and Newark. He connected the dots of racial segregation to the global issues of the oppression of poor and dark people's rights. But he also was clear that the Poor People's Campaign was intended to mark a shift toward the articulation of a new vision for the American economic infrastructure. He pushed much further than Bernie. He pushed much further than the Fight for 15, the Show Me 15 campaign in the state of Missouri. At one point, he pushed even further than the conversation about a living wage. At one point, he argued for a guaranteed annual income for all Americans and raised questions as to whether people should own property. Dr. Carrie Day of Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, in her 2012 book entitled Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America, speaks to the unfinished work of the civil rights movement as the economic freedom of black people with a specific eye toward the plight of black women in America. She researched the ways in which the fictitious, let the church say fictitious, the fictitious political images of the black welfare queen mask the daily realities of the same black women who hold up the black community and surely its church. Dr. Day calls on justice-loving people everywhere, and specifically those in the historic black Israelite church tradition, which produced Dr. King, to take up the work of pushing public policy to help these women build assets. This, many argue, would help to complete the unfinished work of the movement for civil rights. I begin in these places and I journey through this history because when we found ourselves where we found ourselves, when we found ourselves where we find ourselves here in the heart of America, in Ferguson and in St. Louis and in the state of Missouri, people began to look for the throwback, the recall, the remembrance of 2 generations ago to see how we respond and react to the realities that we found ourselves in. When just about 2 years ago, we found ourselves staring traumatized at a young black body lying in the middle of the street. When we saw this thing that quite frankly we see every 10 years in American history. We see the cutting down of an African American leading to an uprising in the streets and leading to the postulating politicians posturing by appointing some kind of commission to study the issue. So I go back to 1968 because that's where we went back to. We started looking for nattily dressed black preachers who could speak the King's English to help guide us through the situation. We began to reach into the resources of American political history and the 100 years worth of riot commission politics that Lindsay Lupo writes about in her book, Flat Catchers. And we began to assess what we should do in helping people talk through the issues. This is what we did in 2014, and we continue in this reality in 2016. And I argue, my friends, that part of what leads us to look to 1968 is the privilege of parochialism in a westernized society that suggests that all of the answers that we look for, we can only find in our own history, as if other folk haven't been here before. I argue this because it led me on a journey. I was not comforted. You may suggest that I wouldn't be very comforted to find out that the work that the governor was asking me to do, that the most definitive academic work on commissions was called Flat Catchers. I was not comforted by that. I didn't feel like that was exactly what I wanted to do, was catch flack for what other folk were doing or not doing. That's not what I was going into. I felt called to the work, but that didn't comfort me. And so I had to figure out how I would find a resource to go forward in the work. And the civil rights era in context, I looked back just one generation and I found something else that mirrored the circumstances that we found ourselves in. Y'all still with me?
Yes.
I didn't have to look back to 1968, I looked back to 1994. If I look back to 1994, I found a situation on the global context, on the global stage, that looked a lot like what we were dealing with in the American context and on the American stage. I recall the experience of apartheid in South Africa. This gross segregation of people, this reflection of distinction of life outcomes that look grossly similar to what we were talking about in the St. Louis metropolitan region. When someone could live by virtue of their zip code or the color of their skin, they live a whole generation longer than other folk who live 10 miles away from them, then maybe that's more like apartheid than it is the kind of things we talk about. Maybe when there is state-sponsored terror, it is state-sponsored when you underwrite it with tax dollars and when you affirm it by allowing people to get off with impunity for doing it. When state-sponsored terror is the order of the day, then maybe you're not looking at an American reality, but rather you're looking at something more like apartheid, or maybe it is the case that apartheid simply exists in America. People are troubled by this terminology that I use. I realize I must back up, because many of us forget about elements of history, and sometimes we don't ever learn about the realities of the ugly eras of our global history. South African apartheid existed from 1948 to 1994. It was the official government policy of racial segregation that was officially renounced in 1992, not until 1992. Y'all got that 1992 too. And so we live through this reality, and the term apartheid simply means apart or separateness, apart, separate, hide, the cognate of our word hood, living separately, living two different lives. Segregation is such an active word that it suggests someone is trying to segregate someone else. So the word apartheid was introduced. Now it has such a stench in the nostrils of the world that they're referring to autogeneous development. What are we talking about? We're suggesting that there is an intentional act to keep people separate and to have people to live different lives with different outcomes. And these, my friends, you should be concerned about, because these are the people that you are called to serve. These are the people that should be on a third of your board. The concept of American apartheid, while it may be offensive to some, I didn't come up with it. I didn't. It's not original to me. I don't have to own it. I don't have to own it. Sometimes it's helpful. I found I'm doing some series at an interracial church, and I realized sometimes it's helpful to have other people say stuff because it may implicate different things. And so it's sometimes helpful for people to say, I didn't come up with American apartheid. Not just so they're not mad at me, because it's actually validated in the voices of somebody else. So when I say that a white sociologist by the name of Douglas Massey came up with the concept, and he walked it through with a sister by the name of Nancy Denton, who's also a white scholar, and it was published in a work called American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass, and that was published by Harvard University. It means more to people than when I say it. But in 1993, they published a work under exactly that title. That powerful and disturbing book linked persistent poverty among blacks in the United States to an unparalleled degree of deliberate segregation they experienced in American cities. American apartheid shows how the black ghetto was created by whites during the first half of the 20th century in order to isolate growing urban black populations. It goes on to show that despite the Fair Housing Act of 1968, segregation is perpetuated today through an interlocking set of individual actions, institutional practices, and governmental policies. In some urban areas, the degree of black segregation is so intense and occurs in so many dimensions simultaneously that it amounts to hyper-segregation. They said it, I didn't. They said it, I didn't. American Apartheid, 1993. That gave me a framework through which to understand the work that we were called to do in Ferguson. And it gave me a framework that was not 2 generations ago, but 1 generation ago, to help others enter into this work, that perhaps what we were dealing with was the persistent reality of apartheid in America. That sociologically, that made some sense to folk, but I'm a practical theologian. I hang out with church folk, and I needed theological understanding. Also in South Africa, one of the things that we recognized that we were dealing with on last year was one of the anniversaries, the significant anniversary of the Kairos document that came out in 1985. The Kairos document was a document where theologians and practitioners of the church in South Africa sought to frame the reality of the circumstances. And in this collectively written document that was written through participatory theology, they crafted in an anonymous way, they articulated the realities of South African apartheid oppression. Why did they do it anonymously? Because they knew that they'd get killed if they put their names to it. So my question is, how did they define apartheid? Every now and then it is helpful for us, and I think this is part of your governance structure, that the problem has to be defined by the people who are impacted by it. And so some wonderful political science scholar came up with the definition of apartheid that I shared with you before. This is what South African theologians came up with. Apartheid is a system whereby a minority regime elected by one small section of the population is given an explicit mandate to govern in the interest of and for the benefit of the white community. Apartheid is a system whereby a minority regime elected by one small segment of the population is given an explicit mandate to govern in the interest of and for the benefit of the white community. Minority regime elected by a small section of the population governing for the benefit of white people. How can I apply that to America today? How does that make sense in America today? First of all, I want to suggest that when we look at our political landscape, and I'm saying all this for a purpose, y'all just stay with me, I'm going somewhere. We can honor that we are guided primarily by a minority regime in America today when we recognize that people of color are a rising majority in the U.S. U.S. News and World Report analysis of Census Bureau data focused on children notes that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 2014, there were more than 20 million children under the age of 5 years old in the United States of America, and 50.2% of them were of ethnic minorities. More than half of the nation's children are expected to be part of a minority race or ethnic group by 2020. You all know this information. The minority population is expected to rise to 56% of the total population in 2060 compared to 38% last year. When that happens, no group will have a majority share of the total, and the United States will become a plurality nation of racial and ethnic groups. You know this, all this from U.S. Census data. That's one thing. What you may not know if you push further is that when you look into this reality of non-white majority counties in the U.S., we also have this issue of a rising majority that is non-white. From 2000 to 2013, 78 counties in 19 states from California to Kansas to North Carolina flipped from minority white counties where there is no single racial or ethnic group as a majority, according to Pew analysis of that same U.S. Census Bureau data. Overall, 266 of 2,440 counties are less than half white. But that's not what the leadership looks like. Y'all don't like those two, so I'll give one more. I'll make this one more try. As we consider the voting age population in America and consider the work of Stephen Phillips in his new book, Brown is the New White, where he analyzes the Obama elections of 2008 and 2012, progressive people of color now comprise 23% of all eligible voters in America, and progressive whites account for 28% of all eligible voters. Together, these constituencies make up 51% of the country's citizen voting age population, and that majority is getting bigger every day. As of the 2013 estimate by the U.S. Census Bureau, just over 311 million people live in the United States, and 217 million of them are citizens over the age of 18. Of the country's eligible voters, 62 million are people of color, 155 million are white, and using this Obama voter percentage as the definition of progressive, just over 50 million eligible voters are progressive people of color, and another 61 million eligible voters are progressive whites. The coalition of progressive whites and progressive people of color who are eligible to vote stands nearly 111 million strong, or 51% of all eligible voters in the country. This is the rising majority in America. This is the new American majority, but this is not the group of people who cut off the protest this morning and went on to vacation without responding to the country's cries about gun violence. A minority regime elected by a small group of people. When we go to Ferguson, we understand also we can look at these numbers and say there are 21,000 people in Ferguson, 14,000 of them are African American, but until the uprising there was only one African American on the school board, one African American on the city council, and a white Republican mayor. They didn't reflect those folks' interests, who's still there, by the way. Elected by a small portion of the population, we also look at this. I want to suggest not only are people elected by a small portion of the population, sometimes they're not elected at all. Can I make a shift for a minute? Y'all not still with me? You might tell your neighbor he about to shift. You might like this next part better than you like the last part. If I can shift for a minute, these people are not only often elected by a minority. You can look at Ferguson where you got 12% turnout for the mayor's election, 29% even with a robust engagement in these small municipalities. You go to places like, you shift from Flint to Ferguson, from Ferguson to Flint. You go to the state of Michigan and you find another thing going on in American democracy, as what Eric Ward of Ford Foundation called a preemptive strike against the demographics I just talked about, a preemptive strike against demographics that people don't like. In the context of participatory democracy, what they do is take democracy away. How do they do that? What are you talking about? This sounds like conspiracy theory. No, what I'm looking at is places like Flint, places like St. Louis, or places like, I don't know, Riverview Gardens, where we displace the concept of democracy and elected officials with school boards. And so this only happens, this only happens in places of a majority of black people. You elect a school board, that's nice. but we're going to set them aside and give them no authority, and we're going to appoint a school board that we like. In Michigan, we see it play out with emergency managers, where between the emergency managers and special appointed school boards that set aside the concept of elected populations, of elected leadership, particularly in the context of where minorities make up the majority. 49% of the state of Michigan at one point of the state of Michigan's black population was disenfranchised because they lived either under an emergency manager taking the place of their elected mayor or under a special administrative board for their school board that they then elected. Minority regime elected by a small majority or not elected at all. Governing in the interest of white people. Why would you say something like that? I'd say something like that because I stand in a state that leads the nation in the disparity out of school suspension for black boys. I stand, my young boys, my 3 sons, go to school in St. Louis Public Schools, which leads to the state that leads the nation in the disparity for out of school suspension for little black boys. I say that because of state and ground laws, including the one that still sits before our governor that he has yet refused to veto. I say that because of ban-the-box opportunities that we have for us all over that lock people out of the chance to get work. Now, what I've just done to you is what I was frustrated with Dr. Putnam for doing to me yesterday. What I was frustrated with is that he did what a lot of these speakers do. He gave me analysis. But then he had one really great slide at the end where he gave me some aims. Aims. What do we do today? How do we respond today in the ways that are faithful to the way our nation did 100 years ago? How might we respond to something so creative as universal access to high school? What he didn't point out, because he didn't know really where he was, is that he was also in the area of Missouri, and St. Louis was also the place that gave the nation its first publicly supported kindergarten, universal and accessible to all people. He didn't recognize, he had on that slide also this concept of home visitation. He didn't realize that it was a teacher in Ferguson that many years ago came up with the model for home visitation that began to be explained and expanded across the nation through the parents as teachers of visitation. He didn't even know that, but it was on his slide. It was kind of cool. The challenge is this: if the unfinished business is the analysis that we have been given, if the unfinished business is that which he laid out yesterday, and the unfinished business is that which I've argued for today, if the unfinished business has the American dream in crisis, and if the unfinished business may give the picture of the American dream that's more like American apartheid, the question is, how do we get from the analysis to the aims? And I want to argue, as I prepare to go to my seat, I want to argue that we get from the aim, we get to the aims from the analysis through community action. When the community finds unfinished business and unanswered questions and an unclear reality for its future, the community has to act. But it must act in certain ways. And so I'll provide one other bit of information, and then I'll lay out why and how I think we need to act. I'm a preacher, y'all. I was trying not to preach, but I gotta go there. I serve a church called St. John's, named after John's Gospel, right? St. John's. What's unique about John is that John calls himself, a lot of preachers like that, John is called the beloved disciple. Nowhere else in the Bible is John called the beloved disciple except in the Gospel of John. John called John himself the beloved disciple. I like that. I like that kind of stuff. Because he believes that his leader, his rabbi, his teacher, the Christ, loves him in a unique and special way. He declares it for everybody else. The beloved disciple. Yep, the beloved. He says it over and over again. No, nobody else says it, but he says it for himself. But there's this unique thing that happens. John, the beloved disciple, is followed by what has come to be known as the beloved community. But there's something that the beloved community finds that is problematic about the beloved disciple. And so I'll just tell you what it is. You can check it later on, ask your pastor, and see if they agree with me. If they don't, they're wrong. I'm just saying, they're wrong. Right? And so John's gospel is 21 chapters, but there's something unique at the end of John's gospel. At the end of the 20th chapter, there's this really nice summary statement. It says, I've written these things down that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and by believing you may be saved. That sounds like the end of a sermon. And John wasn't Baptist. This is a different John. He wasn't Baptist like a Baptist preacher who has 3 different closes for their sermon. That was actually supposed to be the close for the book. That was the end of the book. The problem was, later the community that followed John was left believed that they had unfinished business because of unfinished questions. Unanswered questions still laid out there. There were people in the community that were questioning the identity of that rabbi, Jesus, who has gone on and died. There are people who are questioning the identity of this brother by the name of Peter, who at the end of John's gospel seems like he's out there on his own because he has denied Jesus and he has walked away from the faith, and it seems like he's no good. But later on, he actually starts doing a whole lot of good stuff, so they feel like they need to kind of redeem his reputation. And so you know what the community does? They write another chapter. It is noted by biblical scholars that the 21st chapter of John was not written by the same hand as the 1st through the 20th. Rather, the community, in an anonymous way, decided to take up the work of the writer who came before and to divest him of the authority to make the whole story his own, and rather to write to answer the questions that are left unanswered. I'm suggesting to you that between the analysis that we got yesterday and the aims that were laid out on the last slide, we've got to take some action to write another chapter. How do we write another chapter? I'm glad you asked, and I'm going to give you an answer whether you want one or not. I want to suggest that we find ways to write another chapter in the story of John and in the story of apartheid South Africa that we have seen play out in Ferguson, and we might extend into our work today. What are you saying? The first thing that the community does, and the first thing that we see laying out, is this concept of defiance. Now it's time for you to talk back to me. Let the church say defiance. Defiance. Defiance in John. The community defied the ideologies of this concept of Docetism that argued against the identity of their crucified leader and foregone rabbi, Jesus Christ. In South Africa, the African National Congress proposed in 1951 and launched in April of 1952 what was called the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign was a campaign of organized resistance to the systems of oppression that were keeping the people down. This went all the way through to 1976 when high school students in Soweto began to be responded to in their own uprising by police as well. Defiance is what we saw not on August 9th, 2014, but on August 10th, 2014. The uprising when young people in Ferguson decided to go outside and not go in until somebody gave them some answers. I don't talk about Ferguson without talking about the first 90 days. A lot of people invite me in to talk about the commission's work because that's clean work. It wasn't really clean, but people think that was clean work. I tell people that there was a leadership chasm from August 10th to the beginning of November. And August 10th, young people showed leadership by going out in acts of defiance, and before anybody showed up to say there was going to be a commission in October, before anybody showed up to say we'll study these issues in October, even though it had been called for in August, before we got commissioned in November and began our work December 1st, young people were showing leadership through actions of defiance, and that uprising preceded the appointment of the commission. The question is, what do I do with that today? If my mission is the empowerment, I think it is. If my issue and my mission is the empowerment of poor people throughout the state of Missouri, then empowerment suggests I got to build some power, and in order to get some power, I might have to shift it from somewhere else. What am I asking you to do? I'm asking you, my friends, to extend the uprising. Part of the work that you're called to do in your tripartite board that has these low-income people on it, based upon the original intent of Sergeant Stryver, who came up with the idea of the community action programs in the 1960s, was that these people should be empowered and prepared not just for their uplift for their daily lives, but also the work of civic engagement. And I hate to tell you, there has been no dramatic shift in the sociological circumstances of oppressed people ever on the world's globe without beginning with defiance. And usually that begins with young people. And if you're truly committed, if you are truly committed to the empowerment of the low-income people who are presented at your agencies, then you got to wrap your head around the idea that at some point there must be some defiance, some interruption of the issues that created the circumstances. And that is one thing to teach people how to serve on a board. It's another thing to help people with their utilities. But part of what Sergeant Shriver wanted you to do was help people with the concept of civic engagement. And so you got to hold up for it. Part of what I'm offering to you is not that you got to go into the streets. I'm not suggesting like John Lewis did when he came here to give the keynote address at Washington University in May. I'm not saying you got to get in the way and create all kind of good trouble like he did yesterday. I'm not suggesting you got to do that. I'm suggesting that the interruption and the uprising and the defiance already happened. You just got to extend it.
That's it.
How do you educate people who you are sent to serve about the issues that the uprising raised and how they impact them? How do you extend that interruption and uprising? I didn't like that one. Let me move to the next one. Community action, in order to get there, requires us to engage in defiance. It also encourages us to engage in divestment. Let church say divestment.
Divestment.
Divestment is to deprive or dispossess, especially of property, authority, or title, to undress or strip, especially of clothing, ornamentation, or equipment, to take from a person. In John, the beloved disciple was divested of the singular authority in the band to write the good news of their rabbi. I'm suggesting in South Africa, I'll go ahead. In South Africa, divestment was a global campaign to divest funds, to take funds from institutions with interest in South Africa as a political pressure. What am I suggesting you need to do? I'm suggesting you need to take back authority and take out assets from some places that are complicit in presenting low-income circumstances to the low-income people that you're trying to serve. Can I deal with my own stuff for a second? We just went through a process as Defiance Foundation of outsourcing our chief investment function. We figured we can keep our staff working in the community and not worrying about that corpus. We can pay somebody to do that because we want to do work in the community, right? And so that required us to assess our assets and where they were found. And one of the things that we found was that our retirement assets were with a company called Vanguard. We run their investment management, a company called Vanguard. We began to press that issue with our socially responsible investment policy. And what we found out was that Vanguard had high interest in the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. You making money off sending folks to jail. And part of what we had to assess was, this is the deal, there was nothing we can do with the 5% of the corpus that we give away every year in grants that was going to militate against, or that was going to mediate, or that was going to balance out the fact that 95% of our assets may be used to put people in jail and keep them in the circumstances. When's the last time you checked to see who you bank with? When's the last time you checked to see what were the total holdings of the car company? Some of y'all came from across the state. Y'all might not have driven your own car. You might have rented a car. Maybe you rented from a company whose largest growing business and asset, even though they're rooted in the state of Missouri, actually comes from prison commissary. And maybe when you wrestle with the children who are presented to you for you to serve and help with their utility assistance because their fathers are not in the home, you have to wrestle with the fact that ban-the-box policies and the fact that there's a major company in your community making money off the fact that their dad is in jail. It's something you ought to wrestle with. And maybe you ought to rent from somebody else. Divestment. We got to take assets out of some places that are complicit in the realities that create the circumstances where there's need for the agent. I got to talk about another issue of divestment. The other issue of divestment is we got to take some authority from some people. To strip of authority. I know your tripartite board calls for you not only to have low-income people, but also calls you to have some elected officials on there. And I know that some of y'all are dancing with these elected officials to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do to come with aligned resources and supports and services for the work that you're called to do. And I'm suggesting some of them folk got to go because what they're doing is holding back the work that you actually need to do with your agency to create transformative circumstances for your people. Some of them might be in the room, I don't know. I'm leaving in a minute. But we cannot continue to defer to people who push our agendas off. If people won't show up, we have to deal with this. Alicia knows, we have to deal with this stuff. There were some folk last November Our church convenes every year what's called the Beloved Community Conference, and we begin to reach out to some of our allies who are doing organizing in the community, grassroots organizations, the Organization for Black Struggle, Hands Up United, other folks, Missourians, Empower Missouri, Metropolitan Congregations United, and others, to organize accountability around these commission findings. We said, it's good that the governor has a report, but the governor is about to be out of office. There's some other people who have accountability for some of this work. We're very intentional in the commission's work to identify who were the accountable bodies when we made recommendations, because what we were doing was trying to create a map for the community. This isn't just our work. If you want to make this stuff happen, if you want to go, and I encourage you to go, shameless plug, here comes the commercial. If you're going to go to forwardthroughferguson.org and read the whole report from the Forward Through Ferguson and the Ferguson Commission, and you want to assess how that maps against the work that's going on in your agency, and some of you have already done that because you're just so forward-thinking people, I understand that, I appreciate that. If you're going to go do that, we wanted to show you who's accountable for that work so you knew who to call, who to write, who to visit to make it happen. And this is what happened. Once we knew what the recommendations were, we began to organize with the community to set up a meeting and turn out 1,100 people to say in a room at St. Louis University where Alicia helped us to make it happen. We want to say in that room, this is what the community's agenda is, and you, my friend, are in a position to make it happen. Are you going to use your authority to make it happen? Oh, that was a good, powerful thing to do, except for the fact that one person who is a leading statewide officer in our state, who wants to be an even higher statewide officer in our state, who told us that he was going to be there, told us on Friday that he wouldn't show up for a meeting on Sunday because he had a conflict, as if we didn't know about this thing called a sunshine request. So we asked, well, what's your calendar for Sunday? Could you please send it to us so we know what your conflict is? And what we recognized, there was no conflict. He just got scared off by another scared politician. So we decided we needed to visit that other scared politician that scared him off. And so we showed up on Monday morning and had to occupy somebody's office until they gave us a date that they could make the next meeting so we could go back to the statewide guy and tell him that he could come to the meeting. And in that context, part of what we were doing was taking the authority back for the governance of our community. You are only the representatives because we have allowed you the authority and the mandate to act. And if you do not act in the interest of the community, you will be divested of such authority. And in an election year, this is something we ought to remember, that the authority comes from the people. So we're going to write with the chapter of community action. We got to write the chapter with defiance, and we got to write it with divestment. And then finally, and I was getting on this just a little bit and trying not to step on myself, we got to write it with democracy. Let the church say democracy. Democracy. What I like about what happened in John is that the whole community crafted the text together. What happened in South Africa was that one of the mentors I have found in this work, Dr. Alan Bosak, used the ecumenical bodies and the authority of the South African Council of Churches and others to call for the establishment of what was called the United Democratic Front. The United Democratic Front was a largely rural democratic reality and party that critiqued both the apartheid government that was all white and the African National Congress that was all black, suggesting that either of them was a critique upon what God desired for all of South Africa. That party that critiqued the apartheid government and the all-black African National Congress for not reflecting what it meant to be a free South Africa and the rainbow people of God. In Ferguson, part of what we tried to do with the Ferguson Commission was engage in a process of participatory democracy, whereby we engaged the voices of 3,000 citizens who gave for themselves 30,000 volunteer hours in order to craft 189 recommendations on 196 printed pages of vision, of dream of what their community could be. And they said very simply that we want a community where we place our children at the center of our conversations, where we aim toward racial equity and justice and opportunity are accessible to all her citizens, no matter where they find themselves. When we engage in a participatory process of democracy, this is what can happen. The question is, what are you supposed to do with that? What you're supposed to do with that in your community action agencies is making sure that you are one of those high-performing organizations that Forces for Good, that wonderful book talks about, that high-performing organizations, high-impact organizations don't just serve, but they also advocate. The organizations that get paid the most attention to don't just say how many people they served this year, they also say how many of those people they registered to vote. They don't just say how many people they helped with utility assistance, but they say how many of those people they educated on the issues. They don't just say how many people they served, but they say how many of those people that they registered and they educated did they bring to Jefferson City. So I invite you to engage in this process of democracy because it is time, my friends, to write another chapter. We've got unfinished business in this region and we've got unfinished business in this state. We have a unique opportunity and occasion this year with most of our statewide elected officials wide open, and I'm arguing that we've got some community agendas that need to be brought to bear in the conversations. I'm arguing that we shouldn't be voting for governor based upon who can show the biggest gun in their commercials. But rather, who's willing to have a serious conversation about the state of our kids, the American dream that's in crisis? Who's willing to do the unfinished work and pick up the unfinished business, creating opportunities, empowering people in poverty, living the tragic circumstances and under the intractable issues that you are working to ameliorate every day. If they're not willing to walk with you in defiance, if they're not willing to affirm your work of divestment, if they're not willing to note and affirm your work of democracy, then they ain't the ones you want. It's bad English. But this is good policy. My offering to you, my friends, today is that you have the occasion and you have the call and it's explicit in your work between the analysis of who we are and where we find ourselves and the aims of what we desire for the best of our community. We need community action. And this is your call. God bless you.